Don't we get going here? Well, welcome everybody to our weekly brown bag. It's a pleasure to have everybody here, and it's really a pleasure to have our speaker today. Before I do that, I just want to remind everybody about the upcoming poster session on March 22nd. Colleen sent out an invitation, and so which includes a little survey. So please RSVP, respond, and we invite everybody to come. It should be a nice little part of an afternoon. Today we are really privileged to have Aaron Rabinowitz give the brown bag. Aaron is a first-year student in the PhD program here. He comes from the University of Virginia and Colorado State University, where he's studied drama and philosophy, but his home has been in philosophy and ethics and moral reasoning. He's got a couple of podcasts that are mentioned in his little bio. I've had the pleasure of listening to some of them. They're just really interesting. He's just a very interesting guy. And so he's been teaching for a number of years here in the philosophy department. And so it's a pleasure having him in the program, and it's a pleasure to introduce him for the brown bag. So I will just turn it over to Aaron, and here we go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Drew. Can you all hear me okay? Good. All right, great. So thank you all so much for letting me come and talk about this topic and this community in particular communities in particular that I care quite a bit about. This is work that is related to a paper that I'm working on, hopefully going towards publication, but also a lot of public philosophy work that I have been engaged in the past several years within secular communities. And my hope is to continue to sort of develop a theoretical aspect to that work to bring to those communities. So I look forward, hopefully, to get as much feedback as I can on where you feel like there could be more development of this material. So what I'm going to talk about today is going to be an intervention that I think would be quite valuable within these secular communities, having to do with the development of what I'll call foundational, non-dominant moral capital. That's a lot, and I'm going to unpack all of that piece by piece here in a second. But first, let me actually just back up. First, I'm going to say I want to spend some time sort of addressing some initial concerns that I think folks might often have when hearing about this kind of material related to the question of what do we mean when we talk about secular community or communities, and is it really the case that we are talking about a marginalized community in this case? So to discuss those issues, I'm going to be drawing heavily on some research these are the cover photos of some research that's been done recently by American Atheists and the Secular Student Alliance to try to get a picture of what is going on in these communities. So I'll start by just working through central claims and a little bit of where I'm drawing from in the literature. Then I'll explain why I think this is a community where it would be valuable to engage in these kinds of interventions. And then I'll explain the interventions and some concerns that I think are likely to come up with the application of these particular educational interventions. So central claims, right? I argue that secular communities should encourage the development of non-dominant foundational moral capital as a form of cultural wealth that provides a site of transformation for non-believers, in particular, and especially non-believers who come from religious backgrounds. So I think all of this is going to apply to everyone within these communities, generally speaking. Now, the developing of secular moral capital here, I think, can help non-believers manage the habitus, the sort of negative internal perspectives that they acquire from coping with religious individuals and communities and cultures who see these non-believers as morally deficient. And I will talk through that moral deficiency aspect as part of explaining the marginalization side of things. So I focus on, sorry, just have to get y'all out of the way. All right. So I focus on what I call foundational moral capital, referring to the confidence that individuals develop from engaging with the ethical and meta-ethical foundations needed to ground a robust moral identity. So I'll unpack all of that some here in a bit. The resources that I'm drawing on here, as I said, one major resource is this large quantitative and qualitative analysis that was done, and specifically a subset of that study that was done that focuses in on the young non-believers in their research sample. For the aspect of non-dominant cultural capital, I'm going to be drawing on the work of Carter and Yoso, who are both sociologists and who were doing various field studies to corroborate their theories here. Similarly, I'm going to draw on the sociologist Schwartz, who focuses on moral ecologies and moral capital to explain the moral aspect of this material. So, okay, first part, the secular community as marginalized community. So first, we have to even make the case that we're even talking about a community now, and to make the case that we're talking about a marginalized community, right? So I think it is quite common that in a nominally secular country like ours, especially in communities like academia, where it can feel like the community is generally dominated by secular thinking, that it is fairly easy to lose sight of the experiences of secular people in religiously dominated social fields. And I think to lose sight of how many religiously dominated social fields there still are out there, even within our society. So to back this up, right, this research is the largest to date study of non-religious individuals in America, 34,000 individuals studied. Now, I should say this was, individuals who self-selected to be a part of this study. So there are some limitations on what we can infer about this material, but I still think given the size of the group, I think the statistics that we're going to look at and the fact that those statistics tend to be corroborated by research done on these communities by other researchers, I think it's fair to say that this is an important source of information for understanding what I do think continues to be a sort of under-researched and under-theorized marginalized community. Okay, so what is the secular communities or community? Now, generally, I will mostly talk about communities. I'm a little ambivalent on the idea that there is one secular community for a couple of reasons. One is within the secular communities, I think there is actually a lot of resistance to being seen as part of a community. I think you see this to some extent in various different kinds of social communities. One of the reasons I think you see it in atheism, in secular views, is that a lot of these folks don't see their secularism as necessarily an aspect of their identity. They see it more as a belief, or even to go further, a rejection of a belief. And they will tend to think, a lot of them will argue that their sort of non-religious view is a very minimal belief position for them to hold, akin to denying the existence of ghosts and unicorns. And so they do not see it as being sort of a substantial portion of their identity. That being said, I do still think there are recognizable communities, and that a growing number of individuals, I think, are coming to self-identify with parts of those communities. I want to say, I think this doesn't make them sort of fundamentally different from something like the LGBTQ communities, where it may be a little inaccurate and a little sort of monolithic to talk about just one LGBTQ community, but it does seem quite important to talk about the various communities that are out there, and we'll see how those communities can intersect with some of the groups that we're talking about here. So to make the case that there are these communities, let me look towards the two groups that are that collaborated to create the studies that I'm going to be citing here, which are the American Atheists and the Secular Student Alliance. Now, you may not have heard of the American Atheists before, but they are a group that goes back to 1959, so they are 60 years old at this point, and they originate from after a landmark First Amendment case called Murray v. Curlett, and I wanted to read from the case because I think this particular quote sort of plays to the question of whether this is a community in the sense of being unified by a lifestyle and an ideology, because that might be one way that you could define there being a community in this sense. And I want to apologize, this has fairly dated gendered language. Your petitioners, this is in reference to the people who are bringing the case, right? Your petitioners are atheists, and they define their lifestyle as follows. An atheist loves himself and his fellow man instead of a god. An atheist accepts that heaven is something for which we should work now, here on earth, for all men together to enjoy. An atheist accepts that he can get no help through prayer, but that he must find in himself the inner conviction and strength to meet life, to grapple with it, to subdue it, and to enjoy it. An atheist accepts that only in knowledge of himself and knowledge of his fellow man can he find the understanding that will lead to a life of fulfillment. So I think there is a fairly clearly enunciated identity and ideology that is bringing together a group of people in direct opposition to attempts to marginalize them by a much more active religious majority at time. To further back that up, right, since that time, American Atheist has frequently been involved in civil rights cases involving freedom from religion and religious exemption issues, which, as you're probably aware, have become more difficult to make under the current Supreme Court. They, as a group, have provided crucial information to both governments and citizens with regard to these communities, like the reality check survey that I'll be relying on here. They provide scholarship programs. They have something like 170 local partners and affiliates. They hold yearly conferences. All of these, to me, seem to play to the reality that this is very much a community and should be understood as one, and specifically one that comes together to help its members cope with marginalization. To add to that further, right, the Secular Student Alliance, which is a group who creates spaces primarily, I think, for undergrads, though I think they also do some work with high schoolers as well, to sort of generate their own student-run organizations where non-believers can come and build community, discuss issues, etc., feel like they can express their identity without concern. They have something like 280 student orgs, 3,000 secular programs. They've impacted at least 65,000 students as far as they know up until this point. So all of that to me suggests that we are definitely talking about communities here, at least, if not a community. Now, let me talk about the identity side of things, because identity is also, I think, a very particularly tricky issue when you are talking about an identity that is centered around a belief in this particular kind of way. Now, when I was looking through these materials from the reality check, one thing that surprised me actually as a lifelong non-believer was the number of individuals in the communities that they were surveying who identified as, to some extent, an atheist. Generally, in my mind, atheist has been sort of one of the more hot button or sort of off-putting of the terminology that is used in this sphere. And so I think in my mind, more people have tended to gravitate towards less confrontational terminology than outright atheism. But what they found was that amongst people surveyed, 57.1% strongly identified as atheists and 94.8% somewhat identified as atheists. Here's a more sort of detailed breakdown of the different identities within these communities. That being said, I will still tend to use the language of secular, non-religious, and non-believer, and you'll notice on the covers they also use the term non-religious. I think it's still the case that atheism can feel exclusionary to agnostics and other individuals who might not necessarily believe that they have come to have a strong claim against the existence of God or gods. So That said, sometimes atheism still creeps back into the language, I think, a little bit, and you'll see some of that. Something else I want to add here, uh, I want to reiterate throughout this discussion that we want to avoid treating these communities as monolithic. People have had a wide range of experiences within these groups. Only about 14% were raised in non-religious households. Only about 14% were raised in strictly religious households. So the other 70% are experiencing some mixed range of religiosity within their lives. Okay. So now I want to narrow in on the secular youth portion, since I'm focused here primarily on sort of educational intervention. I thought it was valuable to look at this subdivision of the material that they've put out. So this is the tipping point generation, which is just taking from those 34,000 surveys, roughly 10%, which are the 3,400 individuals between the ages of 18 and 24. They didn't survey anyone younger than 18 for this. I think it's reasonable to infer that younger individuals would also be having likely similar experiences as what we'll see is being described here. Now, they had a range of experiences. As I said, we don't want to treat it as monolithic, but at the same time, I think we can look at several data points and say there is some evidence, some consistent evidence of marginalization here. Now, for folks who are curious about religious background, like what categories are we talking about here? We're primarily talking about Christian upbringings, mostly Protestant and then Catholic. There are, some from other religious backgrounds there as well. I think it would be valuable to get more information on the kinds of the individuals' experiences that are coming from non-Christian communities, so that we, as secular organizations, don't end up focusing too much on one kind of non-religious experience. But okay, that being said, let me talk about some of the evidence in my mind of marginalization here, right? So, well, first, let's talk about family support. What we see amongst these communities, amongst these young individuals, is wide ranges of degrees of family support for their secular identity. So more than 1/3, 37.5%, of youth surveyed reported that their parents were somewhat or very unsupportive of their non-religious identity. That number gets worse, right? LGBTQ youth participants encountered a higher level of family rejection than other youth, which seems to me completely unsurprising. There is also, and I'll talk in a second about the intersection between the non-believer identity and racial identities. But I just want to note, this is significant because of these individuals, right? Of these ones who experience this, they were about 2/3 more likely, 65.5% or so, to screen positive for depression than those who did not or were not sure they experienced a negative family event. So that is, to me, a substantial sort of visible psychological cost that is being exacted on these individuals because of this marginalization. So let's see. This then, I think, let me talk a little bit about identity and race, and then I'll unpack further the costs of that kind of depression and marginalization. The group, the survey did include racial information, and as I understand it, the next subdivision, like the tipping points piece, is going to be a deep dive into the intersection of race and non-religious identity. I can generally, I think, have theories about what is likely to come up in that data, both anecdotally and based on other research. It seems to be the case that people of color have particularly challenging experiences navigating their secular identities, both in their own communities and in the heavily white and what I would say is frequently anti-woke secular communities that are available to them online. There are a lot of things that we could talk about that I think are challenging and off-putting in those kinds of communities. If you're curious about what kind of research already exists on this, some things that I would suggest are a great piece by Swan, Don't Tell Me You're One of Those, Qualitative Portrait of Black Atheists, Allen's book, The Black Humanist Experience, An Alternative to Religion, Abbott et al.'s work. They all have great names, like Isn't Atheism a White Thing? Centering the voice of atheists of color, and Abbott et al.'s sort of anti-atheist discrimination, outness, and psychological distress among atheists of color. So I think there's plenty to show that not only is sort of non-believer a marginalized identity in many fields in society, that marginalization intersects with marginalizations having to do with both gender and sexual identity as well as religious identity. That last paper, by the way, deals in particular with concealment and authenticity, which is another major thing that we see in the surveys that I've referenced here. So 63.4% of individuals surveyed report that they always or mostly conceal their secular identity around their extended family. Here's a more detailed breakdown of what kind of concealment occurs and where. I think it's generally the case that because atheism or non-believers as a community are, it is easier to pass, right? It's easier to hide your identity as a non-believer. You probably see higher rates of individuals doing so for the sake of getting along with family and other communities. That doesn't mean there isn't a substantial cost, of course. As Fraser points out, concealment can lead people to feel a lack of authenticity, to have difficulty establishing close ties with others, to experience more social isolation, and to have lower feelings of belonging and psychological well-being, all of which are the kind of things you would expect to see would contribute to, as we saw, higher rates of depression among the individuals who feel marginalized and so need to conceal their identity. Now, it would be enough of a concern if this marginalization was just sort of accidental or a side effect of us having many religious fields that we still have to engage in. But I think it's worse because it is actually connected to specific stereotypes of non-believers. Most importantly, I want to talk about the stereotype of the immoral non-believer. Now, there are a lot of forms of this stereotype that range from the moral psychology view that secular individuals can't be can't be motivated to act rightly if they don't believe in God, or they lack the kind of soul that would allow them to do the right thing, or as has become more popular nowadays, people have shifted from, because it's become evident that non-believers aren't serial killers all the time, right? That they've shifted towards a meta-ethical argument like this one from PragerU, which makes the case that even if secular people can pretend to be moral, they don't have a genuine moral understanding or justification that can support their doing so. So they're effectively acting irrationally when they act immoral, which I think is an equivalent to a kind of I'll just say I don't think that it's a fair way to represent these individuals. So you see, as a result of this, something like over 50% of the youth surveyed that somewhat or more strongly agree with the statement, people have told me that I am not a good person because I am secular and non-religious. I think if you were to swap out non-religious there for the other kinds of identities I've talked about, that would just be an obviously marginalizing, harmful statement for someone to experience. But I think because of the cultural and philosophical background to this particular stereotype, this reads to people as being more like a theoretical position and less like a marginalizing claim. But the impacts, I think, are significant. Gallup in 2019 recently found only 60% of Americans would vote for an atheist compared to 66% for Muslims, which I point out because Muslims are, I think in America, still a highly marginalized community, but because I think they are religiously coded, they rate above non-believers in this kind of sense. The only group that rated lower in the survey was socialists with 47%, which is not at all comforting given the common association in people's minds between socialism and being secular, being non-believers in this way. Now, the one silver lining here I will say is this is a substantial improvement from the 18% that Gallup found in 1959 or 58, right, the year before American Atheist is founded. But that being said, I still think we've got a long way to go there. And I think further evidence of this is found in both Pew Research polls and in work by folks like Will Gervais, who has done a bunch of studies on the pervasiveness of the immoral atheist stereotype within religious communities, I think it's fair to say that especially young atheists know that authenticity will cost them, and there were maybe limits to the kinds of opportunities, like getting to be president, that they might experience in their lives if they are sort of forward with their non-believer identity. Okay, hopefully all of that has provided sufficient justification to make you feel like there is a need for an intervention here. Now, the intervention I'm presenting is based in my own interests in moral education and the work I've done in these communities, giving talks about ethics and meta-ethics. And so I'm going to now work through all of the different pieces of that. So the first one I want to talk about is non-dominant capital. Both of these sets of theories that I'm drawing on are sort of building on the cultural capital work of Bourdieu, who sort of lays out arguments for why the sort of reproduction of social inequality is the result of the reproduction and valuing of dominant capital within the dominant portions of society. So the first part that I want to look at here, deriving from the work of Carter and Yoso, applies ideas from critical race theory to this theory of cultural capital, and specifically raises a critique, which is that the view, while I think very productive, leads to an undervaluing of non-dominant capital in marginalized communities, and leads in turn to the deficit view model of education, which says that these communities lack capital and need to be infused with dominant capital. So instead, they're arguing that we need to increase our valuing of non-dominant cultural capital as a way to shift from this deficit model of education towards an asset model of education. The kinds of non-dominant capital that they put forward are aspirational, navigational, social, linguistic, familial, and resistance capital. So to unpack those a little bit, these are going to be things like, in the case of linguistic and social, the kind of code switching that individuals have to do between ways of speaking and communicating as they move between social fields. This is going to be things like navigational capital, whether that's navigating encounters with police officers or navigating encounters with your Fox News addicted religious family members. This is going to be aspirational capital, like believing that you can, achieve things that have generally been excluded from people in your marginalized community that you haven't been allowed to do. Resistance capital, building up the ability to cope with being marginalized in these various kinds of ways. So I think it's generally fair to say that I think in all marginal communities, though there isn't concrete evidence on that yet, but I think it's likely the case that in all marginalized communities, non-dominant cultural capital plays a fairly crucial role in the lives of marginalized individuals, and that it constitutes a kind of cultural wealth that is undervalued in our dominant educational paradigms. Okay, so I'm going to combine that then with moral capital. So moral capital, this is coming from the work of Schwartz, who was studying sort of marginalized, very low income young individuals in the suburbs of Cape Town, I believe it was. And what she found was that these individuals worked to try to develop different kinds of what she called moral capital. So she refers to these as the qualities, capacities, intelligence, and strategies and dispositions that young people acquire, possess, and can grow in the pursuit of moral maturity. So for example, could be things like possessing or being seen as possessing compassion or trustworthiness. Now, I think it's interesting to note, right, when it comes to this kind of capital, like with other kinds of capital, you don't actually necessarily have to possess it, right? If someone sees you as really smart, you can trade on that whether or not you actually are smart, right? And similarly, if someone sees you as trustworthy, you can trade on that whether or not you actually are, though I think it's fair to say that being these things genuinely tends to produce better results for individuals. Another example of this kind of capital would be understanding meta-ethical debates. So we can, I think, focus too easily just on the normative level of the kind of classic issues that we think of, like courage and compassion, and think less about having a firm understanding of what grounds the claims about morality. And that can be a particular issue when, as we saw, your immoral non-believer stereotype turns towards meta-ethic debates, where I think a lot of secular individuals feel anxious and underprepared. So this kind of moral capital, right, can be traded on to develop social economic capitals of various sorts, just like other kinds of capital, which is important. But I think more important for our purposes is that this kind of capital can allow individuals to transform the kinds of harmful habitus that they experience from being enculturated to think that their non-believership cuts them off from some kind of moral knowledge or moral truth. Okay, so putting those things together, we get, and then putting them into these communities, right, we get secular non-dominant moral capital. So this is going to be specifically forms of moral capital that are undervalued in religiously dominated social fields and provide substantial value within marginalized secular communities. For example, at the normative level, we could talk about the ways in which these communities allow for a greater plurality of lifestyles by sort of prioritizing, to use Moral Foundation's language, by prioritizing autonomy and concern for harm and reduction of harm over things like sanctity and authority. This is, you see a lot of pushing back and forth about these kind of issues within the culture wars. And I think it's fair to say that one of the values of the growth of secularism within our society is that it has brought with it this kind of social and cultural liberalism. So at the meta-ethical level, right, there is the kinds of philosophical arguments that can ground not just belief in morality, but in my opinion, a valuing of objective moral truths, which is something that a lot of secular people are really uncomfortable with. A lot of them, I think, have really internalized the idea that if you don't believe in God, you can't have objective morality. You can't have truths about morality that are independent of human belief or society or something like that. And so what they end up doing is making some sort of case for, if not cultural relativism, something more robust, some sort of cultural constructivism that allows them to infer, like Shelley Kagan does in his arguments against William Lane Craig, that there is still a robust morality that we can appeal to. It's just not objective in the really thoroughgoing kind of sense that we don't actually need. I tend to disagree with Kagan and think that we need, well, I tend to think that we need objective moral truths, and that being able to defend ourselves against these arguments that we have to adopt subjectivism could really be valuable for individuals who are coming out of religious backgrounds in particular and feel like they have lost some objective moral truth that they had access to in that religious community. So all of this comes together, and then the last feature I add in that I've been referencing a little bit is the foundationalism. There are lots of different ways that you can talk about truth and moral truth, like coherence versus foundational. I tend to be a foundationalist and think that it helps to just give people like discussions of concrete foundational moral principles like respecting autonomy and reducing harm, and that people can sort of readily understand those and readily understand the tensions between them that lead to the kind of pluralism that we want to encourage. So what I mean here with then is the kind of confidence of understanding and kind of comfortableness with discourse that an individual develops from a moral education involving sufficient familiarity with both moral principles and moral psychology. So just having a lot more time to engage with these arguments in situations where your identity doesn't feel especially threatened, and so you can really work through the material. I think we don't provide this in public education for reasons I'll talk about in a second. And many students don't have access or even support to try to get this kind of material, even if they were, attuned enough to realize that they wanted it and were out there looking for it. So ultimately, right, the goal here is not to develop a kind of hubris or moral certainty to counteract religious hubris or moral certainty, but to ameliorate the feelings of being overwhelmed and underprepared when addressing challenges to your secular moral identity. Okay, so I will wrap up real quickly here with a couple of concerns and things that I might be interested, sort of future research that I'm considering working on in this area. One practical concern here that I've mentioned is attempts to promote secular non-dominant moral capital are likely to face fairly distinct challenges both in public schools and within marginalized communities that have relied heavily on religion as a system of unifying the community and fighting oppression. So those are sort of two angles at which we could face conflict, and they're coming from slightly different directions to some extent. I think, you know, the reason that you don't see moral education or much philosophy at all in K through 12, except with the, you know, with the exception of like theory of knowledge courses right at the end of high school, is that I think there's a deep fear of indoctrination into around these ethical and philosophical questions that has made it the case where, you know, there's a lot of pressure not to talk about a lot of topics, and not to be encouraging sort of open inquisition into the foundations of morality. So I think that's one aspect. And then, as I said, for many marginalized communities, their community wealth is often closely tied to the church. I'm thinking of things like liberation theology, for example. And so they have an understandable anxiety about anything that could threaten the solidarity provided by that religious community. Add to that the sort of anxiety of the stereotype of the immoral non-believer, and it's understandable why you would see sort of adverse reactions to attempts to secularize young individuals within these communities. So this is where I think groups like American Atheist and Secular Student Alliance are incredibly important. They can create spaces where hopefully not just secular individuals, but religious individuals who want to learn more about their secular cohort, right, or their secular peers can, you know, go and have conversations like this and explore all of these different kinds of issues. I think realistically, it's going to be hard to get more of this into younger curriculums, which I think is what we really ideally would want. And so providing these communities for young individuals, I think, is the next best option a lot of the time. So finally, some further research that I'm curious about. You know, I want to do more field research in terms of being in these secular communities and learning about what kinds of specific moral capital intervention, whether that's, you know, giving a talk about metaethics or leading discussions about metaethics or providing sort of primer materials, are the most helpful for ameliorating the harmful effects of the stereotypes around non-believers. I'm also interested in getting more information about what the baseline ethical and metaethical literacy is amongst these communities. I feel like my sense is that it's fairly low, but I would like to know more about that. I think part of the reason there is that these communities have tended to heavily emphasize science as a pushback to religion and have tended to underemphasize philosophy as a pushback to religion. And then finally, this is something I've been working on this semester in Dr. Chin's class, taking his work on what he calls the apt error model of metacognitive research and activities and applying it to metaethical reasoning. I think there's actually a lot of important overlap between the meta-epistemic work and the meta-ethical work. I would go so far as to argue that the meta-epistemic work is a subset of the meta-ethical work with regard to beliefs, and sort of our obligations around beliefs. But I think there's a lot of value in just getting people thinking more about the issues of metaethics, not even necessarily getting them committed to moral realism or something like that. Okay, so I will end it there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Does anyone have questions? You can raise your hand via Zoom, use the chat, whatever you'd like.
Hi, so I'll jump in. And start us off. So this has been a fascinating talk. Thank you, Aaron. It's really, really interesting stuff. I am wondering if you know, I don't think this is exactly what you looked at, but it's something that I've been thinking about in my own life. So when you think about secular, first of all, I see deep differences between secular, atheist, agnostic, right? Those don't all mean the same to me. And one thing that I think is interesting about some of the ways that some people are secular is that there's this notion of community. You mentioned community and marginalization, right? And the points about not being authentic and not feeling like you belong. I'm wondering if there are situations that, or people who have written about groups of people who do what is considered traditional things, right? Like traditional holidays. Like I'm Jewish in a sense, I'm secular. But I do the holidays because, that's when you get to see families and their traditions. And, and unfortunately, those traditions are associated with sacred texts, which I'm not a fan of, but, you can't really separate them. But I have a lot of friends who are in that, they don't go to church or shul or whatever. They don't participate in any other way, but they do the holidays, much like people do Christmas trees and Christmas presents. And that does provide community in a sense. So are there communities of these secular people that do pseudo-religious stuff in order to get the community and sort of buffer against the adverse psychological effects of being marginalized, but are not, religious, versus people that are atheists that shun, right? Or people that not necessarily, but that shun away from that and are not willing to participate in anything that has historical roots in religion?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I would say I can't speak as much to, I do think you see some of that in the discussions in the like reality check material. What I think is particularly funny to me is I come from a very similar background of, my full name is Aaron David Rabinowitz. I come from, Jewish Bronx heritage. And at the same time, I identify as atheist, have always identified as atheist. It was never like a discussion within our family, but we also did the high holiday. You come up to New York City for Passover, and that's the thing that you do. And I think those sorts of situations really do provide a rich space for looking at the way that identity is very complex and sort of constantly evolving, the way that my own family sort of slowly phased out the readings over the course of the years of Passover, right? And slowly phased in more kinds of food that we actually wanted to eat and such like that, right? I think that is very important, valuable space. And one of the things that is really important to me in the secular outreach stuff is making space for individuals who want some sort of mix like that, right? Moving away from the new atheist model that was very toxic in the early 2000s, that like was so dismissive of religious community in a way that I think made it hard for people, that I think made words like atheist toxic, right? And so I would love to see and look at more research about those sort of penumbral fringes of the secular communities, where people, I think, filter back and forth towards degrees of, well, I see myself as a believer, but in something like I went to Unitarian Universalist churches growing up. So like I have spent a lot of time in spaces that are like the question mark of, is this really a religion or something? So yeah, I think that's a really great question. Thank you. I hope I answered it enough there.
Anyone else? We have one in the chat.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Drew.
We'll take the chat one. Take the chat one first.
Okay, so Amy said, when you say you'd like to see interventions for younger students, do you mean middle school level rather than high school, or even younger?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I'm not an expert on sort of moral development side of things entirely, but my sense is the people who've been doing research in advocacy for philosophy at younger ages have said that we wildly underestimate the ability of young individuals, very young individuals, to start to engage with fairly abstract philosophical questions as well as concrete ethical dilemmas. So I think it's fair to say we could be doing this stuff in elementary school in a way that was productive, alongside things like entry level, like very beginning critical thinking kind of stuff. Like in my ideal world, right, there would be, as part of the core curriculum, a theories of knowledge and understanding course that was all about teaching people the basics of critical thinking, the basics of moral education, the basics of metaphysics, these kinds of questions from a very young age, because I think it provides a lot of resources for them to deal with a lot of things that are a big problem in our world right now, ranging from post-truth issues to online cults and all sorts of stuff.
Okay, Drew.
Yeah, so thank you, Aaron. This was great. So I've been thinking a bit about this, and I'm wondering, when you think about community, there's the community, the secular community, but you juxtapose that against the religious community. And I wonder if I think about particularly, Orthodox kinds of religions, leaving the fold seems to engender that same sort of, rejection, questioning from the religious order, whether one becomes secular or one goes to another kind of religion. I mean, it's not like the religious community somehow feels like people who don't share their religion are somehow moral. I don't think, maybe tell me if I'm wrong, morally better than the secular folks, right? So is it leaving the religion, or is it actually the commitment to secularism that is sort of the core of the issues that you're raising?
So it's a really great question, Drew. And I would love to get some more hard pieces of data. Drew asked me about communities before this talk as well, and that's why there were several extra slides to address his very reasonable concerns. Here, I think, I want to get more data to back this up, but my experiences, my understanding so far is that is not actually the case. That it is the case that, generally speaking, religious individuals will look more favorably on members of other religious groups than they will on non-believers. That they will in effect say, well, look, they don't believe in my God, but at least they believe in a God. And especially when you're talking about Abrahamic traditions, I think it's very reasonable to say that, a Protestant is going to be less concerned if their child, converts to some more moderate version of Protestantism or something like that, than if they completely convert to non-believer status. So I do, and I think, again, this is tied specifically to the immoral non-believer stereotype. I think individuals will tend to believe that members of other religious communities are still committed to an objective ethical code that will constrain their behavior more effectively than if they were truly members of a non-believer community. That is certainly my sense.
Okay, going back to the chat, Kristen, she said, typically in thinking about marginalized communities, one of the defining features is positionality within a power structure. For example, marginalization of women due to the positionality within the patriarchy, or marginalization of people of color due to positionality within the system of white supremacy. What would be the equivalent for secular individuals? Is it named, theorized?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kristen. So, and again, here I feel like I immediately want to fall back onto, we should talk about sort of fields of dominance and that sort of thing, because I do not deny that there are secular fields within our society where these individuals are not likely to experience as much of this kind of marginalization. But I do think we could point to a system, and I've been doing a lot of reading on colonialism recently, and my real impression these days is that there is very little daylight between concepts like colonial capitalism and whiteness and Christianity, that like Christendom and whiteness are heavily overlapping concepts here. So I think one could argue that like the same systems that you are pointing to there are also tending to marginalize non-believers because they are tending to be of a religious persuasion. I think we can also point to specific fields in which secular individuals are marginalized in various ways, ranging from, like, as I mentioned in the talk, our current Supreme Court is heavily slanted towards Christian originalism in a way that is going to continue to lead, I think, to rulings that make it easier and easier for religious individuals to object to various kinds of laws being applied to them in such a way that will cause harm to a variety of individuals, I think, including marginalized individuals. And then I think a lot of the fields that we are often talking about here are at the local community family level, that we're often dealing with sort of small scale communities, but that have a substantial impact when there is a kind of risk of being ostracized from the community if you do not stick to the general religious culture there. So I do think there is some theorizing around that. And I think you see it also in the material that I referenced about the experiences of atheists of color as well.
Thank you. I definitely think like my question and Drew's probably go hand in hand. And with like Ravit saying in the chat, like if you did this study not in the United States, it would be a totally different kind of marginalization. So I think like one, you were talking about at the beginning, like, is there any way that you could further develop this work? I think that would probably be the biggest area, is like the definition of the marginalized community in terms of the power structure. So like, are you talking about white Christians? Are you talking about white Protestants? Like, who is it that is having power and using it to like marginalize these people in what ways? And then all the stuff you talked about, like the negative stereotypes, all falls definitely from that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so like, I think you'd be right to say, for example, that in America, predominantly, I mean, it's not true because as we saw, some of the community individuals are coming from non-Christian communities, but we do see a lot of people coming from non-Christian communities. And so I think a lot of the fields that we're looking at are centered around white Christianity. But it would certainly be right to say that, you know, if you're talking about I think there's at least a dozen countries where you can still be put to death for being an atheist, right? A lot of those are going to be marginalization that's coming from a different religious background, generally speaking.
Okay, I have another one in the chat from Christian. To what extent does a theory of moral capital and moral capital interventions depend on, quote, meta-ethical positions, e.g. moral realism, moral relativism? And or you mentioned you tend to believe in moral objective truths. How does this affect your approach to moral capital interventions?
Yeah, so let's see. So first, I don't think that theories about moral capital necessarily depend on a particular meta-ethical position. I think you can just as well create a functioning theory of moral capital that's fairly subjectivist, that, you know, basically just talks about the way that people perceive other individuals around them as being more or less moral, and how they approach them as a result of that. But I do think, you know, as I said, personally, I tend to identify with moral realism. I think that it's important to be a moral realist, and I think what that would probably mean in terms of my own approaches to moral capital intervention is that I tend to advocate for a kind of objective pluralism that helps secular individuals avoid what I see as the traps of sort of naive cultural relativism, and that allow them to simultaneously say there can be multiple right answers to how one ought to live ethically speaking, but outside of that range of right answers, objectively right answers, in my opinion, there is a large range of unacceptable, right, objectively wrong answers, right? It's never okay to be the Nazis. So I think that could potentially be different from kinds of interventions that were more subjectivist, that just wanted to talk about helping people generate their own internal cultural justifications rather than getting into the kind of weirder meta ethics that I think the moral realism involves talking about. But sorry, let me add one more thing there. I also think it's important that we push back in this way because, as I said in the talk, religious theists are often arguing nowadays that it's the objective part of the moral thing that we can't get a hold of if we are secular. And so confronting that head on, I think, is better than ceding to them the idea that we can't have objective morality, which is just like if you read, you know, if you read ethical philosophy, it's considered an absurd position that you couldn't have an objective morality without God. Anyone who thinks that you couldn't have an objective morality in that world doesn't think it because, generally speaking, you are missing the God feature.
I think we have time for one more, if anyone has anything.
I have a really quick question. First of all, just thank you so much for this talk. It was really interesting. I was thinking about your point at the end about where this would be implemented or how you think about it, and trying to think through what the current state of kind of this moral education is. And the main example I could think of was actually like debate, at least within the context of I'm familiar with like certain types of like ethical debates that go on like at the high school level, but it's mainly more like an extracurricular that I think for the most part is associated with more like elite education. Although like I have a history of debate doing it in public school, but I know like in general, the whole activity often involves like traveling, and, you know, traveling to debate tournaments can be expensive and that sort of thing. But I'm curious just, yeah, what you think about if you've been tracking kind of debate as a form of developing ethical education, and what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, it's a great question, Olivia. I'm it's funny because I've been coaching Ethics Bowl for about 10 years now, which is I think the thing that you're thinking of, which is, for folks who are not familiar, Ethics Bowl is a team debate activity. They get their ethics questions ripped from the headlines, and then they have to argue for a position. I was invited to start a team when I was out at Colorado State, and then I put one together here at Rutgers as well, and I love it. I think it is absolutely one of the most important like mechanisms, and I think you're totally right that it is prohibitively difficult for a lot of individuals to engage with it. And so I would love to see downshifted versions of it that could be done in classrooms, because I think there's a lot of good evidence that dialogue is central to the development of the kinds of cognitive techniques that we're talking about here. So yeah, I think 100% more debate about hot button issues rather than less. And I think it's generally the case that we have done students a disservice by creating a lot of spaces in which the default position is to shy away from like debating these complex ethical issues.
Okay, I think we're ready to end here. Thanks, Aaron, for your presentation.
Thanks, Aaron. It was great.
Thank you all so much. These were great questions. I really appreciate it.
Just a quick note, next week, spring break, so no brown bag. So we'll be back on the 24th with Molly O'Connor. And that's it. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, so I need to